how do we know for certain that a particular piece of pottery is the date we think it is? You've got trays full of pottery here, and at that point, apart from asking Blinkhorn and if he's not available, what you're also resting on is the fact that over hundreds of years archaeologists have found material in stratified contexts. And sometimes it may be as simple as a piece of pottery that's Roman greyware. That may have been found in the context of something where there was actually something really dateable. So they've been able to get the date from something else, something obvious like a coin maybe. And so over the years, archaeologists have built up typologies. And typologies are quite an old-fashioned concept really. But if you take a simple example of brooches, you're all carrying mobile phones with you, and you lot could tell the difference in a phone typology between an iPhone and one of those big chunky Nokias that you'd all have a laugh at, you know, the big weight of a brick jobs. Now, Paul's still using this, so if we have two examples, we'll get out our examples.
It might be on the Viking voice.
And I've got a note here, get paracetamol for Danny.
I've been stuffing it without an extra.
So,
here you go.
There's the iPhone, and here is my esteemed colleague's one he got for free.
It's true, I think.
And there's another one in there.
Yeah.
So, very approximately, what you've got there is sort of a glimpse of typology, because if I showed this to Phil and said, what comes first, Phil? He'd go, that one. Over the years, archaeologists have built up typologies, and places like the Ashmolean are extraordinarily rich in sequences of typologies, particularly to do with brooches. The way a brooch pin works, the shape, the size, the decoration on it, is quite an interesting typology. Don't forget, it's not always technologically, so that the more complex one may not necessarily be the later one. It might be that we've lost a bit of technology and it comes and goes. So whenever you find things, what you're hoping is, if you haven't got a Blinkhorn around, you've got some understanding of typology. And that's what we're going to be looking at with Danny today. If you look in your trays here, we've got some lovely examples. I'll give you that back, Paul. Some lovely examples of what Mick always reckons you always find in any test bit anywhere, which is somebody had a piece of blue and white ware.
Transfer printed white earthenware, actually.
Thank you very much. Now look at that. Did you check which? Thank you. Blue and white ware, transfer printed, whatever. This sort of stuff appears everywhere. Now, it wouldn't take a genius to suppose that that is more modern than maybe that, the white coated, but certainly you could pretty well say it's likely to be more modern than that, couldn't you? I'll give you that back on so we don't mix these up. The interesting thing starts to happen when you find a piece like this. And this, Paul reckons, is early Iron Age? Late Iron Age.
Very early Roman, something around about.
Very early Roman.
Not to be certain, but about first BC to first AD.
And you can see the inclusions in that. So Paul, because of his vast experience, has been able to look at this. But you can use your intelligence. I'll give you that back, you put it in the right tray. So running these typologies can be very helpful. You've got to be quite careful about it, but it does begin to enable you to date material. That enables you to date activity in a trench. And one of the interesting things is in James's box here, which is 301, it was trench 3, first spit out the ground. What strikes you about this collection of material that's slightly different from some of your other trays? So you don't answer, because you know. What's different about this as opposed to a little bit that? Certainly this one, very different.
So not so much tile.
Not so much tile or not so much building material. And just from this test bit, I think, you know, Roger and Paul might agree that we might have an example there of a test bit which is diagnosing what? What can we know from that collection? Not you, because you know.
It's not building rubble, but it's living.
Okay, and that implies that that area is what?
Occupation.
Occupation, but also not negatively,
Not in the building area.
not immediately in a building area. Now we all know rubble and crap is your own garden, it spreads all over the place, doesn't it? You know, the wall you knock down ends up in the drive and, you know, all the rest of it. What we've got an interesting example is it would be reasonable to suggest a hypothesis that in this area there appears to be no wall plaster, no floor tile, no roof tile. So James's and Rebecca's area, or this test bit area, may be outside. So it's another example where a small test bit can begin to be diagnostic. Paul, any thoughts? Sorry, Rebecca, yeah.
How does that relate? Bearing in mind, pit 3 was in between the other two pits on the far right. You obviously get a lot of building material, but the fill is supposed to be over the boundary in the other field. So is that suggesting there's an alternative building as well?
Well, I mean, from what we've seen from the geophys, what we're probably looking at, I think Carl said, is a big enclosure. And inside the big enclosure there's a big posh villa. But the villa wouldn't have been stood there in splendid isolation on its own. There would have been workshops, kitchens, things like that. There would have been other structures within it. Now, these things kind of work on the same principle, I suppose, as big country houses. When you're approaching on the road, you'd see the front of this magnificent villa. You go around the back, and that's where all the blacksmiths working, and then maybe if they've got a potter inside, the potter's working. All the dirty stuff's going on around the back, away from the buildings. There might even have been timber buildings around the back. There might not have been stone. So you're probably in that area. You're possibly round the back of the big posh building where
Roger, what does that imply?
where all the blacksmiths is going on, if you like.
Sorry, is that reasonable from a status point of view around here? The idea that effect, if you've got hypercores, mosaics, wall plaster, status-wise, we're talking about a higher end of.
It's a high status place in this local context. There isn't a huge number of really big villas in this part of the Thames Valley. So it's important.
So the other thing fines are telling us is status. And it may be there's some differentiation, no wall plaster, or it may be different use.
I'd go for function.
Function. So two things you want to make a note about on your pads is function. Are your fines telling us what activities went on there? Status. Are you at the poor people's end of the organisation? And very appropriate of the big question is date, chronology of what you've got.